720 coffins. That was the number recorded in the ledgers of the Worshipful Company of Carpenters for the first week of August in 1665. The normal production of London before the epidemic ranged between 140 and 160 coffins weekly, a stable number that met the natural mortality of the city. The difference of 560 coffins represented a rise of 450% in demand. Parish records confirm that week 893 people were officially buried. The problem was not just the volume, it was the speed. A traditional coffin, produced according to guild standards, took between 6 and 8 hours of craftsmanship. Dovetail joints, beeswax finish, wrought iron hinges. The math did not add up. 720 coffins in 7 days, working in 14-hour shifts, would require at least 240 carpenters dedicated solely to this production. The Guild had 187 registered masters throughout London. And if you are thinking, wait, how did no one notice that these numbers didn't make sense? Welcome to my job. I have spent 4 decades asking this exact question about ledgers from 300 years ago. If you enjoy seeing someone engage with dead spreadsheets and uncover historical accounting frauds, subscribe to the channel. I promise every video will have at least one number that will make you pause and think, no, wait, this doesn't add up. Back to the carpenters who were definitely not keeping up with the workload. What happened was a break in the very concept of production. The standards were abandoned in the second week of August. The technical records of the time show the transition. The dovetail joints were replaced with simple, direct nailing. The wax finish completely disappeared. The iron hinges were replaced with braided hemp ropes. The average production time dropped to 2.5 hours per unit. They were no longer coffins in the technical sense. They were rectangular boxes of raw pine with removable lids. The thickness of the boards was reduced from 25 millimeters to 15 millimeters. The average weight of a coffin fell from 32 kilograms to 19 kilograms. This reduction was not merely a matter of material economy. It was necessary because the gravediggers themselves were dying. The records from the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, one of the hardest hit areas, document that, of the 23 gravediggers hired in July, only 9 remained alive in September. A lighter coffin meant that a man alone could carry the dead to the grave without help. But the numbers still did not add up. Even with the radical simplification of the process, the production of 720 coffins per week required a workforce that no longer existed. The answer was found elsewhere in the records. The Special C. Permissions issued by the Guild. Between August and October in 1665, 143 emergency apprentices were registered, men with no formal training in carpentry, recruited directly from the streets. Bakers, stevedores, coal porters. Any man with strength in his arms willing to work, surrounded by the dead. They were not paid the standard rate of a carpenter, which was 3 shillings and 6 pence per day. They received 1 shilling and 8 pence, less than half. And there was no formal contract. The records classified them as temporary emergency sanitation workers. What this meant in practice was that if they died during work, and many did, their families were not entitled to any compensation from the Guild. They simply disappeared from the books. 37,000 cubic meters of pine. That was the strategic reserve of raw wood kept in the warehouses of the London Timber Company at the beginning of June in 165. The records of inbound and outbound from these warehouses, preserved in the archives of the East India Company, show a stable pattern. Average consumption of 1,200 cubic meters monthly, regular replenishment via trade with the Baltic countries, primarily Sweden and Norway. The logic of the time was simple. London was a wooden city, and wood was treated like any agricultural commodity. It had seasonality, it had safety stock, it had a predictable profit margin of 18 to 22%. But in August, when the production of coffins exceeded 3,000 units weekly, the consumption of pine skyrocketed to 9,600 cubic meters monthly. A single batch of simplified coffins consumed the equivalent of an entire month's worth of residential shipbuilding. The strategic reserve of 37,000 cubic meters was supposed to last until the end of the year. It lasted until mid-September, when regular stocks ran out. Prices reacted brutally. The cost of 1 cubic meter of raw pine, which ranged between 9 and 11 shillings in June, reached 38 shillings in the third week of September. Customs records from the Port of London show desperate attempts for emergency imports. 3 cargo ships were dispatched to Stockholm with unlimited price purchase orders. But there was a logistical problem that no amount of money could solve: the crossing time. A merchant ship took between 14 and 18 days to cross the North Sea under normal conditions. The wood requested in September would only arrive in October, and in September, London was burying 4,000 people a week. The emergency solution came from a source that did not appear in the official commercial records: unauthorized urban demolition. Abandoned houses in quarantine areas were simply dismantled overnight. Structural beams, flooring, doors, windows, everything became raw material for coffins. There are no official records of these demolitions because they were technically illegal. But there is indirect evidence in the reports of post-epidemic reconstruction. In January in 1667, when the city began to reorganize, 461 structures were listed as missing without documented cause in the parishes of Stepney, Whitechapel, and Shoreditch. They were not ruins, they were absences. Empty lots where 2-story houses once stood. The wood from these structures had a problematic characteristic: it was contaminated. The boards came from houses where whole families had died from the plague. The medical theory of the time attributed contamination to miasmas, putrid vapors that permeated porous materials. Wood was considered highly susceptible, but this did not stop anyone. Coffins made from demolition wood cost half the price of coffins made from imported pine. And for families who had already lost their breadwinner because the head of the household was dead, this price difference was the line between a Christian burial and a mass grave. The carpenters knew the origin of the wood, they knew the risk. But records show that the infection rate among carpenters was 63% between August and October, significantly higher than the general infection rate of the London population, which stood at 41%. 18 days. That was the average time between the onset of symptoms of the bubonic plague and death, according to medical records compiled by the Royal College of Physicians. But for the carpenters working in the mass production of coffins, there was an additional variable: continuous exposure. A carpenter in normal conditions had indirect contact with 1 or 2 bodies per week. He built the coffin, delivered it empty, received payment. During the epidemic, coffins were often built on site, alongside the dead. The parish records of St. Botolph show that in 67% of the documented cases in August and September, the coffin was assembled inside the deceased's own residence. Not by preference, but out of logistical necessity. There were not enough carts to transport the dead to centralized workshops. The carpenter arrived with pre-cut boards, nailed the box around the body, sealed it, and left. The average time for this process was 45 minutes. 45 minutes breathing the same confined air that had killed the person just hours earlier. The ledgers of the Worshipful Company of Carpenters record payments to widows of 29 master carpenters between July and November of 1665. The Guild had a relief fund for families of deceased members, £3 sterling per widow, plus 6 shillings monthly for each child under 12 for 2 years. But this benefit only applied to masters in good standing. The 143 emergency apprentices did not qualify. When they died, Their families received only the wages for the days actually worked, nothing more. Records show that 51 of these emergency apprentices died before the end of October. 51 men who accepted to work surrounded by corpses in exchange for 1 shilling and 8 pence per day, and whose deaths generated no official compensation beyond prorated payment. The mortality rate among this group was 35%, nearly 9 times greater than the rate among regular master carpenters, which was 4%. The difference was not in the quality of the work, it was in the type of work. Regular masters continued operating in centralized workshops, producing empty coffins that were delivered by third parties. Emergency apprentices were sent directly to the infected homes, but there was another layer of cost that did not appear in any official records: the cost of delayed infection. 23 carpenters, among masters and apprentices, developed symptoms of the plague, but survived. The overall survival rate of the bubonic plague in London during that period was estimated at 15%. Surviving, however, did not mean full recovery. Later medical records describe permanent sequelae, necrosis of extremities, fingers, ears, partial loss of vision, chronic lung damage. For a carpenter, the loss of 2 or 3 fingers was not just a mutilation. It was the end of his working capacity. The tools of the time required precise gripping strength: hand saws, planes, chisels. A man with 3 fingers on his right hand could not operate a plane in a controlled manner. He could not hold a chisel with enough pressure. Of the 23 documented survivors, only 9 returned to full professional activity by the end of 1666. The other 14 were reclassified in the Guild's records as unfit for skilled work. They received a reduced pension, 2 shillings per week, but lost their status as master carpenters. Technically, they remained alive. Economically, they had been extinguished. A coffin sold in Whitechapel in the 2nd week of October of 1665 cost 2 shillings and 4 pence. The receipt, when it existed, only listed Pine Coffin Simplified Standard. No indication of the wood's origin, no record of the supplier. But pine did not grow in London. It came from outside, and someone had to be profiting from this chain. The customs records at the Port of London for that month show 0 imports of raw wood coming from the Baltic. 0. Trade routes with Sweden and Norway had been interrupted in late August when Scandinavian ports began to refuse ships from London for fear of contamination. The wood, somehow, continued to arrive, without an official trace, without taxes paid upon entry, without shipping documentation. The answer lay in the river records, not the port records. The River Thames connected London to the interior of England, and wood could be transported by barges without passing through any official customs post. The files of the Thames Conservancy, the authority responsible for river navigation, record a 340% increase in the traffic of cargo barges between August and October of 1665. What these barges were carrying was not specified in the manifests, just general cargo. But there is a revealing detail in the toll records of the locks at Teddington and Richmond. The average weight of the vessels going upstream was normal, between 3 and 4 tons. The average weight of those going downstream towards London was 9 to 12 tons. Someone was carrying something heavy downstream. And raw wood, in large volumes, was the only commodity that justified this weight differential without generating formal customs records. The suppliers were rural sawmills in the interior of Surrey and Berkshire, small family operations that normally sold for local construction. During the epidemic, they redirected all production to London, but there was a technical problem that the river records did not capture: quality. Baltic pine was controlled reforestation wood with cutting standards established by the Swedish Timber Export Guild. Uniform boards, minimum drying time of 6 months, low incidence of knots and cracks. Pine from the interior of England was native woodland timber, cut on demand, without standardization. The complaint records of the Worshipful Company of Carpenters show that 41% of the coffins produced in October exhibited premature structural failure, cracks in the sides, bottoms giving way under the weight of the body, lids warping before burial. This was not just an aesthetic issue. A coffin that cracked during transport to the cemetery created an immediate sanitary problem, bodily fluids leaking through the seams. The grave diggers of St. Bride's Fleet Street sent a formal petition to the Lord Mayor on October 23rd, requesting additional compensation for exposure to liquid miasmas resulting from inadequate containment. The petition was denied, but the real problem was not the quality of the wood. It was in who profited from the difference. A cubic meter of Baltic pine cost, before the epidemic, 10 shillings. A cubic meter of rural English pine cost 4 shillings. The margin for intermediaries who bought from the interior and resold in London was 150%. And these intermediaries did not appear in any official commercial records because they operated exclusively through unregulated river transport. The official mortality rate of the Great Plague of London was 15% of the total population. The consolidated parish records account for 68,596 deaths between June of 1665 and December of 1666. Modern historians estimate that the actual number was closer to 100,000, the difference explained by deaths not recorded in poor areas where the administrative collapse was complete, 15%. It seems like a manageable number compared to other epidemics of the time. The Black Death of the 14th century killed between 30 and 60% of the European population. But 15% of a city of 450,000 inhabitants means one death every 6 minutes for 18 consecutive months. It means that each day, for 547 consecutive days, 183 London families lost someone. It means that the funeral industry of an entire city had to multiply its capacity by 5 in less than 8 weeks, and maintain that pace for more than a year. The production numbers confirm the scale. Between August of 1665 and November of 1666, approximately 72,000 simplified coffins were produced in London. 72,000 rough wooden boxes, hastily nailed together, transported by men who knew that each load brought them closer to their own death. If each coffin took, on average, 2.5 hours to build, from the initial cutting of the boards to the final nailing of the lid, that represents 180,000 hours of carpentry work. 180,000 hours is equivalent to 20 years and 6 months of uninterrupted work by a single man. But it wasn't one man. There were 230 carpenters, among regular masters and emergency apprentices, working simultaneously in 14-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with no weekly rest, no religious holidays, and no breaks other than those strictly necessary for eating. And of those 230 men, 80 died before the end of the epidemic. 80 men who built coffins for others until they reached the point of needing one for themselves. But the real cost of this operation cannot be measured just in direct deaths. It must include the widows who lost their right to pensions because their husbands were emergency apprentices with no formal status in the guild. It must include the 14 mutilated survivors who lost their ability to work and were reclassified as unfit. It must include the 461 houses illegally demolished to provide wood, houses that represented shelter, family heritage, decades of savings turned into bricks and beams. It must include the grave diggers who contracted the plague carrying cracked coffins that were leaking contaminated fluids. When you add all of this up, documented deaths, unregistered deaths, permanent disabilities, property losses, unpaid compensations, the real cost of burying 68,000 people was not 68,000. It was closer to 90,000 lives destroyed or permanently altered. 90,000 human units consumed to maintain the minimum of funeral dignity during 18 months of sanitary collapse. And in the ledgers of the OIC Worshipful Company of Carpenters, all of this was recorded as emergency production period, net profit, £240 sterling. The records were closed in December of 1666, and the Worshipful Company of Carpenters returned to normal standards, as if 80 men had not died building boxes for a city that buried its dead faster than it could count them. But there is one detail that no auditor recorded. In the annual inventory of tools, 32 complete sets were listed as not returned, carpenters who never came back. The Guild did not follow up, did not charge, did not investigate. It only noted material loss due to exceptional circumstances. 32 men were worth less in the official books than the cost of replacing their tools. If you want to keep unearthing the numbers that history preferred to forget, subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments which historical process we should audit next. The investigation never ends. It only opens new files.